Welcome to the show. I'm Olivia Nunn, and this is where we rise, rebuild, and remember that storms don't break us, they reveal us. So let's get into it. I'm here with a very, very dear friend of mine, Lara L.J. Johnson, who is a well-renowned author, badass mother, beautiful friend, and keynote speaker, traveler. I just could go on. I just love you so much. So, LJ, so happy to have you. Let's jump into your story.
Olivia, thank you so much for bringing me on today and sharing your wonderful audience with me. I am very honored to be here. And yes, you are a dear friend to me as well. And I will tell you that none of us get here by accident, right? I think there was a reason we met when we did. And, since then I've seen your journey, you've seen mine, and there's been a lot of ups and downs, as it happens in everybody's life. But the difference is, how do you, just like your show is called Unbreakable Storm, how do you ensure that you get through that storm without being broken? And I think a lot of people that have gone through some adversity and challenges typically will break at some point. So I love the fact that you are here helping so many other people understand how to not break when the storm hits. So, yes.
Thank you. You spend an incredible amount of time traveling all over the world talking about your grit system. And you detailed that in your book, which I love, by the way, Hunt or Be Hunted. And the fact that I could spend just a little bit of time with you today, I appreciate that. But before we can get to your bottom moments, talk to me about your journey. Like, where did it start? Who you were, and then how did you get to your grit?
I would be very honored to do so. So I will tell you, for those of you that don't know me or don't know my story or haven't read anything about my story, it started from a young age, really. I went through a lot of grit from a very young age, and I've been through several traumas in my life, of which I don't have loads of time to talk about on the podcast today, but I do detail some of it in my book. But I went through several traumas before I even got to here in America. Obviously, I have an accent. You can tell from the sign that originally I was from England. And I had a very successful career over in the UK. But personally, I went through some very hard times. And, I'd been through sexual abuse. I was held against my will. I've been beaten. I went through some horrific scenarios of really what nobody should ever have to face, let alone in a very short time frame. But each time something bad happened or I went through some type of trauma, I was always able to get back up and brush it off and continue on. And I didn't really question like how or why I was able to do that. I just did it. That's all I kind of knew. And it wasn't until many years later that I was having a successful career over in the UK. I was a successful sales director and I helped build sales teams and companies and so forth. And I loved it. And I loved some of the people I worked with. However, I realized that the mentality of a lot of people, not just in the UK, but just people I had been around and so forth, I realized a lot of people had a fixed mindset. And I'm not about that. I'm always about growth. I'm always about, well, how can you make things better? How can you, be that person that is going to prove to the world that you can do more? And I realized that I had to take it upon myself to do this. So I made some really hard decisions and I decided to up and leave the UK and come to a country that I absolutely adore, which is the United States of America. I was introduced to America from a very young age through my father, and I got to understand the culture a bit. And so I've always had this obsession, if you will, with wanting to live out here. And I always wanted to become an American. I always dreamed of having an American family. And I just wanted the American dream. And I felt that in England, my hands were kind of tied. It was very restrictive for me over there. And not to kind of get into that now, but I will tell you that it felt very liberating when I finally got on that plane and I knew that I was going to start a new life. Now, I didn't have a lot of money at the time. I was successful in what I did, but I had also had to use a lot of it I'd gone through a divorce over there and so forth. And then I also had to use it to survive for a little bit before I, came to the US. Whatever I had left, I decided to lock away. So I didn't actually want to touch it because I didn't want to have anyone tell me, oh, you only made it in America because you had some money. No, I wasn't going to do that. So I came over to the US with absolutely nothing other than a laptop and my brain. And I said, okay, well, I don't have a social. I can't go and work for anybody. What am I going to do? Where am I going to live? What am I going to eat? So a lot of hard decisions came my way, and I decided to start a business because that's all I could do, right? And I knew like one or two people when I first came to America, and I put myself in situations where I could meet other people. And what I mean by that is, I'd go to coffee shops, I'd start seeing patterns emerging. Around 7 a.m., there was this group of who I didn't even know who they were, but they ended up being entrepreneurs. Some were business owners, and they would meet every single day, Monday through Friday at 7 a.m. without fail. And one day I just had the courage to go up to them and I introduced myself. And that really started a lot of great friendships and relationships with people from a business perspective, where they introduced me to people, and my business started to grow this way. And before long, I was able to bring some money in. Now, it wasn't all great sunshine and rainbows, right? There were some very difficult times as an entrepreneur. Life can be really challenging. There can be ups and downs. You don't know where your next paycheck's going to come in from. And bearing in mind, this is someone that's starting from absolute scratch, that really didn't know anybody. And that's why I always say, if anybody out there says that they don't know how to do something or they can't do it, listen, you do it anyway and you learn along the way. You just go and do it. You face your fears. And most people don't achieve what it is they want to achieve, or they do break during the storm because of fear. And I've always said there's 3 different fears. There's fear of failure, fear of imperfection, or fear of the unknown. And I think we can all relate to one of those fears. I hold my hand up and I say, like, I've had all of those fears at one point. And I would say I still have fear of the unknown, because you don't know what's around the corner. And so, but once you learn to embrace and say, okay, well, what's the alternative? Okay, what are my options here? And you start to accept the position that you're in, the situation that you're in. Once you accept it, your brain can start to process, and then you're able to park it and allow for creativity to come in to help find a solution. So this is what happened with me. And so there did come a point where I didn't have enough money, though, to pay rent. And at one point I was homeless. I had to sleep on people's couches. And I didn't have enough money for food. I didn't have a car. I was very lucky in the sense that I had built such great relationships with people that when I started to tell them what had happened, they came to help me. So one of them lent me a car, another, let me crash on a couch for a couple of months until I could get myself back on my feet and so forth. And somebody else even went to a grocery store and bought some groceries for me. So you don't get anywhere in life completely on your own. You have to have a great support system. And again, I knew nobody, and I started building up my network just through putting myself in the right environments and putting myself in situations where I could meet people and being very genuine and authentic with them. And that's what people love the most, because there's a lot of BS out there. And when you are open and honest and you are genuinely authentic with people, that speaks volumes. And so I was able to build up an incredible support network. And so as time went on, about 18 months in, I ended up meeting my now ex-husband, and had 3 beautiful children with him. So now I'm like speeding the process along here. We're going along a few years. I still had my business. It's doing really well. And at the time, my ex didn't work. So I was supporting him and our children and so forth. But I loved what I did. And so I didn't ever have any issues in that moment of, the pressure or anything. But what I realized looking back is I made a mistake in terms of I started to take my foot off the gas a little bit. And I thought, I've had so much trauma hit me, so much that nothing could possibly now go wrong. I have a family. I've made it in the States. I'm here in the US. What possibly could go wrong? So instead of, but like I always say, choose your grit before grit chooses you, I stopped putting myself in difficult situations I stopped making hard choices, and I kind of became a little complacent, which I think we can all admit to. We do that at some point, right? Sometimes we run back to the comfort zone because it's what we know. And it was in that moment that I faced the biggest challenge of my entire life, and all the other traumas that I've been through, which quite frankly, are absolutely horrific, didn't even amount to what I'm about to tell you. And it was 4 years ago that, unfortunately, the biggest tragedy of my life occurred, and my youngest son, Jack, passed away. And that very same night, I almost nearly lost my life as well. I was about 8 seconds from flatlining. I'm extremely lucky to be here, and I wish every day that my son had been saved, but unfortunately it was too late for him. And that night rings true so hard to me that I remember as if it happened yesterday. And I remember being rushed to the hospital. My son had already passed away. And there was a lot of confusion between the different units, between the ER and the paramedics and so forth. And I think a lot of people got confused. They don't quite know what was going on. And they'd hooked me up to all these machines. And all of a sudden, I just remember sitting bolt upright in this hospital bed. And I said, "Get me water, I'm going to die." And they said, "You can't have water, you can have surgery." I said, "Get me water, I'm going to die." I could feel literally everything draining from me. And what was actually happening is I was losing a lot of, I had internal blood loss. And so I didn't have my heart didn't have enough blood to pump around my body. And so my organs had started to shut down one by one. And it was a feeling of major intense thirst, and I just knew this was going to be it. So I collapsed back on the bed. I remember my blood pressure plummeted down to 53/37. And still to this day, I don't know how I was still conscious, but I'm a fighter. And I guess, I held on till my last breath. And I remember the nurses suddenly screaming for an emergency blood transfusion. I see the crash cart being pulled into the room. And all I can think about in this moment is, I'm never going to see my children again. I just witnessed my youngest pass away, and now I'm not going to see my other children. And that scared me. And that really scared me. And I said to myself, "No, Lara, like you have to fight now. What's the best thing you can do in the situation?" And I always say to people, when you're trying to create belief in a situation for something to happen so you can be motivated to act on it, you've got to change your environment. And I knew that I couldn't change my environment physically, but the one thing that I had control over still was my brain. So mentally, I knew that I could change my environment. And so in those few seconds I had left, and I knew that with the next beep and flash of that machine, I would flatline. I actually watched my grandmother pass away this way, and that's also how I knew. So I said to myself, "Lara, you have two options. Number one, you either accept it and you die. Number two, you either accept it, you're probably going to die, but you have to trust that they're going to bring you back. Let's face it, you're going to flatline, they're going to have to resuscitate you, but you have to trust they're going to bring you back." And that's the option I went with. And I just knew in that moment that the only thing I could do was now apply a technique that I've taught a lot of other people. And I thought of myself back at home with my living children, who were only 2.5 and 1 years old at the time. And I use a technique called the 5-4-3-2-1 technique. I said, what are the 5 things you can see? What are the 4 things you can hear? 3 things you can feel, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing that you can taste. And as I did that, I had tricked my brain thinking I was back at home with my kids. And so what happened is my anxiety started to reduce, which slowed my heart rate, which allowed the nurses and the doctors in the room more time to figure out how to get the 16 gauge needle into my collapsed veins with the blood that saved my life. And my life was saved. Now, a lot of people don't like to talk about the aftermath of going through any type of adversity or challenge or change. And why did I share this story? Because you don't have to have gone through something as severe as what I've just described. Anything that's challenging that comes your way, you could be going through, whether it's now, whether it's in the past, whether it's going to be happening at some point. Because if you haven't faced grit, you will at some point. I hate to say it, but grit will come knocking. So you're better off to be prepared for when it does. So what's the best way of doing that? Well, they whisked me off into surgery. My life was saved. When I woke up from that surgery, the first thing that I was asked was, "Do you want to have your son buried or cremated? Here's a death certificate." Or, "Which funeral directors do you want to use?" As if I knew the funeral directors in town. And I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that these doctors were asking me these questions. And it wasn't until months later that I started to get my head around all of this. And when I was released from hospital, I didn't know what I was going to do. I actually suffered with anemia for quite some time because they didn't give me enough blood. They gave me enough to keep me alive, but I actually ended up not having enough blood. And so I had anemia. I couldn't walk unassisted. I couldn't walk up the stairs. I couldn't drive. It was absolutely horrific. So I actually slept on my couch for quite a few months. And on the one night that I decided to try and make it up the stairs, and I wanted to sleep in my son's bedroom, and it just turned into the new year. We're now talking January of 2022. And I remember saying to myself, Lara, you are a leader. You have a company. You're, like I said, my ex-husband didn't work. I was supporting him. I was supporting my kids. I had a team of people. I couldn't let these people down. I had my little kids looking at me, smiling, happy all the time. And I didn't want them growing up with a mother that could not pull herself out of this spiraling, dark place that I'd found myself in. And so I remember waking up in Jack's room and walked into the bathroom that morning, and there's a mirror in front of me and a window behind, and the sun was just beaming through this window, and it bounced off the mirror and onto my face, and it was like a light bulb just going off. And I suddenly said to myself, Lara, you got to wake up today. Your son did not. You get to feel the sun on your skin today. Your son does not. Stop making this about you. It's not about you. It's about others. What are you going to do with all that pain, that grief, that trauma, and how are you going to use that to help empower others? And it was in that very moment that I realized, I said, well, I have to understand how I've even grit through all of these prior traumas. How have I done that? And why am I struggling so much to grit through this one? And that's when it dawned on me that everybody that knows me as a get it done person, right? Someone that's a go-getter, that no matter what happens, I can pick myself up, I can brush things off, I get on with it because I'm a solution-focused person, not a problem-focused person. But in this particular scenario, and I'm sure a lot of people can relate, when you've had a real big challenge come your way and you haven't ever had to face something like that before, you haven't had to focus on, the possibilities of not having the solution that you want, what do you do? And that's when I realized, Lara, you have to reframe how you think about the solution. Now, in full disclosure, I have a background in psychology, mental health counseling, and neuroscience coaching. So I was at a bit of an advantage in the sense that I understood how the brain operates. But when you've lost a child, all of that goes out the window, right? You can't just apply that to yourself. But I realized that if I'm able to reframe how I think about the situation, I will finally be able to come up with a solution to at least help and start the healing process. And so I said, okay, you're excellent at being a go-getter. You're not so excellent at being able to reframe the situation. So let's train your brain into how to do that. And this is something that everybody can use in their life, right? So if you have something negative happen to you, I'll give you an example with a sentence. So if you say to yourself, look what happened to me, instead of saying, look what happened to me, I started saying, look what happened for me. Right. And just changing that one word, or look what's been taken to me. I'd say, look at what has been given to me. So instead of seeing it as something that had been taken or this, complete distress that I was in, I reframed just a couple of words in a sentence. And as you do that, and you can try it, anyone listening can try that, even now, a sentence in your head, think of something that happened to you recently that didn't go to plan. Reframe, change a couple of words. You have a physiological response. And the more you do that, the more you're able to start to train your brain into thinking differently. And a lot of people don't realize this. And I talk about this in my book, but a lot of people don't realize this, but 80% of your thoughts are negative. And 90% are repetitive. That is huge. So already as a race, we are up against a very tough uphill battle, right? With our own mindset, with our own thinking. Why is it that way? It's just inbuilt in us. It's, from 10,000 years ago when we were, we had threats of being eaten by mountain lions and stuff like that. It's just, that's how we survived. And in a way, it hasn't really changed. We're not going to get eaten by mountain lions now, but it's, we're faced with competition every day. We're faced with the unknowns every day. We're faced with financial struggles, and there's so many other things that come our way. And sometimes people are facing so many battles that we don't even know about, that you might think there's nothing wrong with them. You have no idea, right? Everybody is going through something. something, right? Just because they don't vocalize it or publicize it doesn't mean they're not going through it. So how can we help not just ourselves, but others, right? We have to teach how we can reframe situations. And so this is something that didn't happen overnight. This took a long time, to instill in my own thinking, because I'll be honest, there were days when I felt like I was drowning, and I would start to picture myself trying to just keep my head above water and kind of and paddle in the water, so to speak, and just try to take those breaths. And in those moments, that gave me hope. And I realized, okay, I got this, Lara. You're having a tough time right now. You're facing these struggles. But if you keep instilling these techniques and doing the practical side of learning with this, it will pay off, right? It's like going to the gym and working out, and in time you start to see the results. It's exactly the same. We train to be fit. Why can't we train our brains, to be mentally fit? And so that's why it is so crucial that you do carry out these exercises. So I said to myself, well, if you're able to get things done and reframe how you think, you're then able to impact others. And if you can impact others, you now have to take responsibility with every action that you do, because every action that you do or you don't do has a consequence. And that's when it dawned on me: get it done, reframe thinking, impact others, take responsibility. What have I just spelt from those first? Exactly. Grit. And so I realized, wow, I've just identified the 4 elements of grit. But I'll be honest, it still wasn't enough, because quite frankly, lots of people can talk about grit and that's motivational and inspirational, but how do we actually develop that grit? How do we develop the tools needed in those very moments? It's all well and good saying, well, I've got grit, but then you're faced with, a job loss, or you're faced with a divorce, or you're faced with losing a child, like in my case, or you're faced with some other horrific thing that's going on, no matter what it could be. How do you then develop the grit needed in that particular scenario? So this is when I realized that many people around you, right, whether it's in your family or in the business world or whatever, whoever it is, right, half the people that you meet and maybe you're friends with are logical thinkers, and the other half are emotional thinkers. So what I mean by that is you've got people that think with their gut, and then you've got others that will just be very logical and need the facts and make decisions on that. There's no right or wrong, but there is in certain scenarios. So you can be more dominant in one area, which might not be fruitful for that particular situation. So in my case, with just going back to when I lost my son and so forth, I'm a very logical thinker, but of course I was struggling with being able to apply the type of grit that I'd applied in my prior life, right, through all my traumas. I struggled with that at that moment because there were so many emotions attached to that scenario. And so I had to start learning, how do I marry the two, the logic and the emotions, and how do I create something that I'm able to utilize given any situation and pull from different traits. That's when I realized that there isn't just one type of grit. There's 4. There's 4 different types of grit, and we all have them. We just have different levels of them. And so what I mean by that is, I'll spell it out, but we've got the go-getter, the reframer, the innovator, and the trustworthy titan. You take those 4 different traits of grit and those 4 different types, and you have to realize, okay, which one am I more dominant in? And I did create something called the Grit Type Indicator Assessment. So you can kind of take that test and you can see, okay, where do I fall on that scale? Where am I more dominant in? Where do I fall on the other ones? And that's so useful because now you can understand, well, how do I react under stressful situations? And what can I do and train my brain in order to handle those situations differently? So for example, I'm known as a go-getter, right? I'm someone that just gets things done. But I had to learn how to reframe my thinking. I'm naturally an innovator by, I was kind of born that way. I'm very creative, but in the same tone, I wasn't able to allow that creativity to play at its fullest because I couldn't reframe situations. So you kind of need one with the other and so on. You kind of need all 4, but most people don't know how to train their brains with those different grit types. And so that's how I created the global grit system, because I've got the 4 elements of grit, the 4 types of grit. And then I said, now I need to put it into a system that helps people go from here, from comfort, all the way up to growth. And there's different stages to get there. And, without giving a full-on workshop in it. I mean, I could go on,
No,
but yeah.
I loved your book. And, you talk about fear. And something that I have adopted is that everything starts beyond fear.
Yes.
And which is what you outlined and what you talked about. And what I loved about in your book, and you talked about grit in the 4 different types, is that I am the go-getter, right? I did it and I was like, yep, that's me. I kind of had a feeling before I did it. I was like, I'm definitely the go-getter. But when I was reading through it, the thought that I had was, it was inherent to me that I had all these pieces. And I think I've always had it. I just didn't know what it was, and how some people can rise every single time, regardless of the trauma, the challenges, even if you feel like you don't want to, right? You and I have hit some rock bottom moments in our lives that some people are not going to recover from. You know, we both have suffered a divorce. Businesses have hit rock bottom, transitions in our life. Any one of those can take somebody out. And you've lost, and when I read that in your book, that broke my heart as a mom. But there are some of us that can just, regardless of it, just put it together and rise because it's inherent to us. And then there are others that just don't know how. And I love that your book can give them a path forward if they don't inherently have those pieces. So I loved your book for that. And anybody who's listening, you definitely need to get Lara's book and check that out. You talked about how you have moved from one trauma to another, and you quickly talked about how some people, I say this, it's this box, right? You open the box, you shove the trauma in, you close the box, and we just forget it doesn't happen. But we have to face it, and we have to come to grips with it. For you, where was that for you, and what was that turning point for you? And I know that part of it was writing this book, but where was that aha moment inside that you had to open that box and you had to look at yourself and work through it?
I love that question so much. I would say there were a few different moments. It wasn't just one moment, but I do remember the moment I told you about earlier where I was in that bathroom and I stared at myself in that mirror. That was one of the most pivotal moments of my life, because I realized, Lara, this isn't about you. This is about others. And if you don't get through this, if you don't figure out a way to get through this, you're not only going to ruin your own life, you're going to ruin your children's lives. You're going to ruin everyone else's lives around you because they're relying on you. And that might sound like a lot of pressure, but I put myself in that position. I am a leader. And what does a leader do? They don't run away. They don't run away. They lead. And so I had to learn how to do that. And I will tell you this, that one of the techniques that I love, and I do it every single day, if I'm honest, because let's face it, we always have something coming our way during the day that we're like, oh gosh, I don't have to deal with this right now. But if I don't, it's just going to sit there, it's going to get worse. You mentioned a very good point about, when you have adversity and challenges and change, every time you have something negative, you just try to brush it away. It's not the right way of dealing with it. And I'll explain why. Because every time you have something negative and you don't deal with it, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but think of it like a revolving door, right? You kind of swat it away with such force that it's going to come back and swing back at you and hit you in the face. And it will hit you harder because it's your brain saying, hello, like we haven't processed this. I don't know if this is safe or not. And your brain loves a process and a system. So you have to give it what it needs. So the best way to approach any type of negativity coming your way is to look at it and say, is this serving me? Right? So you have to acknowledge it. You don't necessarily have to accept it. You just have to acknowledge it and say, is this serving me? How is this helping me in this moment? And if it's not, what we do is, and you can imagine, like you can picture yourself doing this, but you literally pick it up, you put it in a box and you put it on a shelf and you say, okay, I know you're there. It's not helping me in this moment, but I know you're there. So if I have to come back to it, I can. But what you've done is you've allowed yourself to free up memory space, kind of like a computer or a phone, right? You've freed up memory space to allow the creativity to come in, to start to reframe, right, some of that negative into positive. You cannot do that unless you acknowledge the negative that's coming at you in the first place, because otherwise what happens is, remember I told you 80% of your thoughts are negative. So every time you don't acknowledge a negative thought, it's just going to keep coming back. And that 80% is going to just start eating you up, and it becomes overwhelming. And that is why so many struggle with not knowing how to get through adversity, because they're so focused on the problem. They're so focused on the negativity without actually acknowledging it and allowing your brain to process it and say, okay, I know it's there. It sucks and it's crappy and I don't want to deal with this. Well, guess what? You thinking that way over and over and over isn't going to help the situation, but at least you've acknowledged it and you've parked it. What is going to help the situation? And when you start doing that, you will find that you can breathe a little better. The anxiety starts to reduce. And for me, that's how I got through those moments. And like I said, that moment I stood in that bathroom, that was one of them. And there was another time actually when I was sitting at my desk and I remember feeling like I was drowning. And I just pictured that image of me trying to keep my head above water. And I just said, okay, I'm taking a breath. That's a win, right? And so you got to acknowledge the little wins, because you cannot get to the goal that you're trying to get to if you keep trying to take massive chunks at it, because you'll end up failing. So you got to acknowledge the little wins and ask yourself, what am I doing today to get me to where I need to be tomorrow? And it could be something as simple as taking 10 seconds and reframing how you think about something in a sentence.
I love that. I just taking bite-sized moments, right? Or as they say, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time.
Exactly.
So I'm curious as to, how did you get to the title of your book, Hunt or Be Hunted? Because honestly, the tiger mama in me likes that title, but I'm just curious as to, where did that come from?
Oh, that actually came from, so I didn't remember, I mentioned I was a sales director over in the UK, and I started off in sales and so forth in my career when I came out of university. And I was always described as a hunter because in sales, you're either a hunter or a farmer. Right. So hunters are the ones that go out, get the new business. They're focused on building the business, getting clients and so forth. And the farmers are the ones that are there to look after the existing customers that, you've secured onto the business and so forth.
The nurturers.
And yes, exactly. And not saying that I don't have that, because I do, but I just naturally am more focused on being that hunter and being a go-getter. Most go-getters are hunters. I don't think I've actually met a go-getter that's not a hunter. So, that it was a play on that a little bit, like hunt or be hunted, because to be quite frank, if you're not hunting, you are going to be hunted. And I often ask the question, how many of you here in the audience, when I'm keynote speaking, I always say, how many of you here in the audience are hunters? And I see, a bunch of hands go up. And then how many of you think you're being hunted? And like, you don't think of yourself as hunters, and they put their hands up. And I said, how many of you don't know? And then I usually see an overwhelming amount of hands go up. And I said, let me tell you, if you don't know, you are being hunted, because it's like our competition, right? If you don't stay ahead of the game, and I'll just relate it to a business sense right now, but if you don't stay ahead of the game and you don't use that creativity or that innovation, because I've always said, if you can innovate your way out of a challenge, it doesn't become a challenge anymore, it becomes an opportunity, right? So if you're able to master that and create that sense of innovation from whatever problem you're going through, and you create these solutions, then you're staying ahead of the game, right? And so you're constantly hunting, whether it's for business or, whatever it may be. But the moment you take your foot off the gas, right? The moment that you turn your blind eye to any grit that might come your way, the moment that you think that you've made it, right? That is where you start to become the hunted. So you never can take your eye off the game. And I'm really strict and very hot on that subject, because also, being an athlete, that is very instilled in me as well from a physical aspect. So not only physically, but also mentally. And I'm a big believer that the two are connected. You can't really have one without the other. And that's why in the book I talk about it, but it's so important to follow the 5 pillars as well. And I won't give it all away here, but you really should follow the 5 pillars that I talk about, and you'll see a remarkable difference. And that's where you start to determine, okay, I can become a hunter. And I'm giving you a really long answer here, but that in a nutshell, it basically comes from my background being in sales and knowing how to hunt for business. And if you don't, and you just expect it to come to you, then you really are being hunted. So.
No, I love that answer. You know, as you're talking, I was thinking about how you're just going, right? And you talked about that you have to constantly hunt. However, on the backside of that is burnout. And even athletes need time to rest, rebuild. So how do you balance that as someone who's saying you have to remain forward focused? So how is balance for that for you?
So that's where I follow my 5 pillars. I guess I will give them away here because I actually do want to talk about that. So I am a big believer as well. There is no such thing necessarily as balance as in a work-life balance, but there is balance between different segments of your life. So what I mean by that is I look at my life in 4 circles, right? One of them is business, one of them is fitness, one of them is family, and one of them is actually my spouse. And so when you look at those, I say, okay, they all have to be equal. And this is where some people argue with me, because I say, listen, there's not one that's more important than the other. And people say, well, you're telling me that your business is more important than your kids? And I said, no, I said they're all equal. Because if I don't apply the type of energy that's needed in my business, I can't support my family. And if I apply too much energy to my family and not enough to my business or my fitness, then my physical aspect goes, my mindset starts to deteriorate. I'm not able to bring the type of money I need to support my family. So they all support one another. Same with my spouse. My spouse has his own circle because he needs his own attention, just like we all do. Everyone does, right? And it's important because they're your partner. And so I look at it and say, how am I able to be go, 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 have all this energy? And by the way, I don't drink caffeine. I don't take any supplements and don't do anything at all in that sense. I mean, I take vitamins, but I don't take anything like performance enhancing or anything like that. My trick is very simple. I go back to the basics of what a human being needs. And I think it's often forgotten about now because we have so many demands of us that people start to turn to caffeine or energy drinks, or they think that they can get by with little sleep. Let me tell you, it's very simple. You want to have energy all the time and be known as an energizer bunny that everybody says to me, follow the 5 pillars. You drink a gallon of water a day, right? That's what your body needs. If you feel hungry throughout the day, you're probably more dehydrated. And if you feel tired, you're probably dehydrated. I can't show you right here because the camera won't allow it, but I've got 3 different water bottles right here in front of me. And I don't go anywhere without water. Number 2, I get between 8 to 9 hours of sleep a night. Sometimes it's 7.5, but you want to try and aim for that sweet spot of around 8 hours. So 7.5 to 9 hours is actually what we need. Many people have tried to argue that with me, and I think it's because they don't know how to have that amount of sleep, but that's what we need. And the moment that you actually realize, because I have people say to me, but Lara, I have this project that's pressing. I have to get this done or that done. And I said, do you know how much more efficient you would be in a day in a certain amount of hours? Like you could get probably 8 hours of work done in 2 or 3 if you were able to give your body what it needs. And sleep is one of them. And our brain is an organ. Our brain needs sleep. Our brain needs water. Why are we not giving it what it needs? Why are we trying to fight it? It doesn't make any sense to me. So one of them is water, one of them is sleep, the other one is nutrition. It's eating clean. None of this processed stuff, right? That makes us sluggish. And I mean, I'm not here to talk about nutrition and wellness and so forth, but I will tell you that if you eat clean, right, which means no processed foods, you will see your energy levels just skyrocket. Take it from someone that's done this for years. I know. I had eaten processed foods in the past. I completely changed the way I lived, and my energy just changed over a few months, and I couldn't believe it. So that's the third one. The fourth one is to get sunlight on your skin for at least 10 to 15 minutes a day. It actually helps your circadian rhythm. It will help you sleep better at night. And the fifth one is exercise, right? So it's actually getting out there, whether it's, and if when I say that word, a lot of people kind of get scared. They think, oh gosh, because they see the type of workouts that I'm doing. And I'm like, you don't have to be so aggressive with your workouts, right? You could go for a power walk. You could go for a little jog. You could just get up and move, right? We were given legs. You got to use them. That's what they're there for, right? Our body loves to have movement. So I'm very big on do something, right? For 5 days a week, get your heart elevated for at least 30 minutes a day. I actually have 2 bonus ones, but a lot of people get scared when I tell them. So I don't know if you want me to tell them, but they're nothing scary to me. I just think
they need to read your book.
Yeah, they do. They really do. They do. But there are there's 2 bonus ones. But I will tell you, follow those 5 pillars, you will finally realize that you can have in quote unquote balance between those circles. And anyone listening to this, really analyze, like, what are your circles? What's important to you in your life? And so when you start to establish that and you realize they are all equal, okay, how do I keep that equal? And also it's good to evaluate. So every couple of months, I'll evaluate and I'll say, if I'm spending too much time in fitness and not enough on my business, I have to readjust that. Or if I'm spending too much time with my spouse and not enough on the business, I have to adjust that, So you have to always look at it and say, how do I create this balance? But in order to do that, I have to physically be healthy, which helps my mind. So.
You have detailed so much information in your book, and it's not a very long read, which I love. What is the impact that you want from people when they pick up that book and they read Hunt or Be Hunted?
I think that is an absolutely fantastic question. And I've been asked that before, and I think it's one of my favorites. I'll be honest, one of the things I want them to take away from that book is to understand that you can develop grit, right? And I even outline the system of how you do that. So I am actually giving them the foundations of which they can then build upon from reading the book. So they've got, the Global Grit system in front of them. And I think, honestly, I wrote that book to wake a lot of people up, to show them that grit is a choice. It's not a gift. It's not something you're just given, right? Grit is a choice. I want them to walk away reading that book with like a fire in them, right? A fire in their chest, a refusal to just settle. I want them to have a mindset that's just wired for execution. And I want them to have this belief, right? Because remember, I talk a lot about having the belief in yourself, but having that belief that they can dominate their lane, no matter their past. Take it from someone that has been through a lot. When you read that book and you realize all the past traumas I've been through, you might think, how can anyone get through all of that? Listen, I have this huge belief I can dominate my lane. It doesn't matter where I've come from. It really doesn't. What matters is the here and now. What am I doing today to get me to where I need to be tomorrow? How am I going to shape that? And really, Hunt or Be Hunted, if you will, is like a mirror, right? It forces you to confront who you've been, and it forces you to realize who you're capable of becoming.
What I really love about you as a person in real life and what I felt in the words of your book is not only the authenticity of you, but that you've harnessed that you had to take accountability and you can't sit on your butt literally, and that you are the master and commander of figuring out your life and figuring out that sense of happiness, whatever that happiness is for you. And you can't blame anybody else but yourself, and you can't remain there. And you're right. If someone has read your book, you've gone through more than most people have. And you could have easily just stayed and said, I'm going to sit here because this thing happened, this thing happened, this thing happened to me, and I can remain a victim. But you don't. You never talk like a victim. You never act like a victim. And you just walk through life with such grace. And I love that about you.
Well, thank you for saying that. I appreciate that greatly.
So we're going to switch a little bit in these gears here. Let's do a little bit of lightning round. What was the song that carried you through your rock bottom moments?
Oh my gosh, I love this. So I actually had an album on repeat for about, I want to say, 2 years. And this was actually after my son had passed. I know this sounds crazy, but I used to listen to, the second movie that came out of Top Gun? The soundtrack to that movie, for whatever reason, I latched onto it, and I would listen to that soundtrack over and over and over and over again. And I think in my head, I was just thinking that there's always something that's going to happen, right? There's always chance. If I don't know if you've seen that movie, or anybody listening has seen that movie. But the one thing I love about it is there's persistence throughout, right? There's that resilience. There's that never giving up. They face a moment. I don't want to ruin the movie in case no one's watched it, but there is a moment in the movie where they don't know if a mission is going to succeed, and they kind of, I mean, it could be a really bad outcome, right? It could have been a suicide mission, really, and they don't know what the outcome's going to be. But they continue to pursue, and they had the belief. They had the belief that everything was going to be okay. And I'm telling you now, that had such a major impact on me. Music is huge to me. A lot of people don't know this about me, but I used to be a singer-songwriter. So I actually have written music. I've released music under a different name. I actually wrote a music for my husband and performed it at the wedding, which was amazing. But music carries such a special place in my heart. And anybody that's going through any type of trauma or challenge, I urge you to listen to music to help you in that moment. But for me, that was the album that I listened to over and over and over and over again. And even now in my posts, there's certain music. I mean, everything that I put out there, everything on social media I put out there with the type of music that I'm picking for it when I'm putting it on Instagram, there's a reason. I don't do anything without reason. There's a reason behind. So that's why I love it when people actually play the sound to these posts, because there's so much more emotion attached to that post when you listen to the music. And there was one of those songs on that album of Top Gun that my son, my oldest son, particularly loved. And it just brought joy to my heart. So every time I felt sadness, or if I felt like I was going to cry in the car, I'd put that song on. And sometimes, he'd be in the car with me when I would do that, and we would sing it together. And that, honestly, music is huge for anyone that's been through any type of trauma or challenge. It carries you in different ways. It kind of unlocks a different portion of your brain, and it just helps you think differently. So I love that question. I'd actually never been asked that question before, so I love that you asked that.
I love it. And I love the fact that you shared a little bit about being a singer-songwriter.
I think that's the first time I've ever actually announced that publicly. So,
and you have to keep digging.
You will never find it. It's under a different name.
So, a quote or a mantra you wrote during your darkest season?
Oh gosh, I'll be honest. There were so many. In fact, I have them. You probably, as you've read the book, you've probably seen a lot of them. I'll pick one from here, because anything that's in here is super, super, super important to me. This was one that I do remember writing. I remember actually being in a cabin at the time, and I kind of hid myself away from the world. I didn't want to see anybody. I wanted to be away from people. I was having a very tough time. And I suddenly realized, the reason I'm giving you a backstory to this quote, and this is why I wrote this quote, is because I saw myself on this really dark path, and I couldn't see the light. Or I could, but it was like a pinprick of a light. And I think I was scared. I was really scared to kind of step into that light, because I was afraid that it might mean that I'm leaving my son behind. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to bring him with me wherever I went. I didn't want him to ever feel like I was leaving him completely behind and I was moving on or something like that. Because I'll be honest, you don't move on from the death of a child. You don't actually move on from the death of anybody. You learn how to live with it, which is horrible, but you don't move on from it. You just learn how to move through the different stages of the grief. And so anyway, this quote that I wrote, I said, "Don't be afraid to step into the light, for it illuminates the path that reveals your authentic self and banishes the darkness of the past. And what I mean by that particular quote is we all have this fear, right? I had the fear of the unknown. I didn't know what it was going to mean for me to step into the light. And when I did, I realized that I'm not leaving anything behind. I'm not leaving my son behind, but instead, I'm actually able to step into who I really am. And the world suddenly saw Lara for who she is, right? And that's why, LJ as I'm now known, but it allowed people to see LJ for who she really is, not this figure that was just trying to be someone that everybody else wanted her to be. She was now real. She was authentic. She was vulnerable. And the moment I did that was a risk. That was a very big risk for me because I didn't know how people were going to react or anything. And then I thought, you know what? Does it matter? Does it matter how anyone reacts to that? What matters is your mission, your vision, your purpose. And so I say to people all the time, I'm like, what is your vision? What is your mission? What is your purpose? And if you don't know it, you have to take the time to ask yourself and figure out what that is. And I will tell you now that when I lay dying on that hospital bed after my son had passed and I knew my time was pretty much up, I said, okay, I started bargaining, right? And I said, if I get to live, if I get to breathe another day, if I get to go back to my babies in the morning, just like I told them I would, because, and you probably read this part in the book, I always said, see you in the morning. That was something I said at nighttime. I was determined to see my kids in the morning. And I said to myself, if you make it through this, your mission in life is to impact at least one person for at least one day for every day you're breathing. And I've never looked back on that. I didn't have to impact thousands at one time. I wanted to impact just at least one person, because if I did, I knew that I lived for a reason and the memory of my son could continue to live on. And I still have a ritual to this day. You know, we're 4 years on. Every single night, I hold his urn and I talk to him and I tell him about the day. I tell him about his brothers. I tell him about everything, right? And that's my way of being able to stand true to who I really am and never forget where I came from. Don't forget who you are today. Don't forget who you're shaping for that person that you want to be tomorrow. But the more authentic you are, the more vulnerable you are, the more open and honest, the more trust you build, not just with yourself, but with everybody else around you. And that's who I am. And if there's people out there that don't like that, that's okay. That's okay. But there's many people out there that do love that. And that's just the way I choose to live.
I love all of that. And I could spend hours, if not days, talking with you, but I know you're so busy. With that being said, where can people find you and connect with you?
Well, there's multiple different ways you can, but one of the things that I really do love to give to people that have taken the time to actually listen to your podcast and take the time to listen to our interview and so forth and learn some of these traits, I would like to actually offer something to the audience. So they can just text the word grit to 33777 and they will have access to my free Grit Global Accountability Guide. And so it gives an overview of the grit system. It has a few different exercises in there that you can do from a workshop standpoint, which are absolutely phenomenal to help just start the process, right? Obviously, you're going to get a lot of information from the book with that, but I want to give the listeners something special because I'm very grateful for them spending the time to listen to this. So if they text the word grit to 33777, they can get access to that. And of course, I always welcome anyone that wants to have a conversation or connect further or has questions, or wants to tell me something about that's happened in their life. Connect with me on LinkedIn. You can either find me through as a contact, but they can find me on LinkedIn. I'm Lara L.J. Johnson. Or on Instagram, I'm at official Lara J, or my website, which is also officiallaraj.com. So multiple ways to be found, but I do really appreciate the time that you've taken with me today. I appreciate the time the listeners have taken today, because like I said, I have this big mission to ensure that I impact at least one person for at least one day for every day I'm breathing.
Thank you, LJ, for spending time with me, just dropping gems, just being vulnerable and authentic with your story, just giving our listeners just a method and a way to be able to get through their own storm so that they could be unbreakable themselves, so that they know how to be a hunter. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Well, I'm honored, and thank you again, Olivia.
Thanks for being here. Keep rising, keep speaking your truth, and always remember, you are the storm. Your truth